Brussels. March 1941. The Gestapo headquarters on Avenue Louise hummed with the sound of typewriters and stamping presses. Inside a third-floor office, beneath fluorescent lights that buzzed like trapped insects, clerks processed an endless stream of documents. Work permits. Travel authorizations. Identity cards. Ration coupons. Each form required multiple stamps, multiple signatures, multiple layers of bureaucratic validation that transformed paper into power. The Nazi occupation of Belgium had been swift and methodical. Within weeks of the Wehrmacht's arrival in May 1940, the machinery of control had been assembled with German precision. But this was not conquest through bullets alone. This was domination through documentation. Every citizen, every movement, every transaction now required approval from the occupying authority. And approval came stamped in purple ink with an eagle clutching a swastika in its talons. To move through occupied Belgium without proper papers was to risk immediate arrest. To be caught with forged documents meant deportation to concentration camps. The penalty for assisting Jews or resistance members was execution. The Germans had transformed an entire nation into a vast bureaucratic prison where freedom itself had been reduced to official stamps pressed into government forms. On this particular morning, a young woman named Andrée de Jongh waited in the basement of a printer's shop near the Grand Place. She was 24 years old, trained as a nurse, fluent in 3 languages. Before the war, she had spent her evenings dancing at jazz clubs and her weekends cycling through the Ardennes forest. Now she spent her nights guiding Allied airmen across the Pyrenees into Spain, moving them through a network of safe houses that stretched from Brussels to Madrid. But the escape line was choking on paper. Every checkpoint required documents. Every train journey demanded travel permits. Every border crossing meant showing identity cards that had to match occupation records held in German filing cabinets across Belgium. The resistance had money, courage, safe houses, and willing guides. What they lacked was the single thing that mattered most in Nazi-occupied Europe: official documentation. Forgers worked from photographs of real stamps, trying to recreate the precise pattern of the eagle's wings, the exact shade of purple ink, the proper weight of the impression. They spent weeks perfecting forgeries that border guards dismissed with a single glance. Something was always wrong. The ink too bright. The impression too light. The paper texture slightly off. German efficiency extended even to their documentation standards. They changed stamps every few months, rotated security patterns, created detection methods known only to occupation authorities. Without authentic stamps, the resistance was paralyzed. With them, they could create perfect forgeries indistinguishable from legitimate documents. The entire machinery of the occupation could be turned against itself. Andrée understood this with perfect clarity as she waited in that basement. She was not planning to forge documents. She was planning something far more audacious. She was going to steal the real stamps directly from Gestapo headquarters. The idea had come from necessity. 3 British pilots were hiding in an apartment in Schaerbeek, waiting for papers that would allow them to board trains heading south. A Jewish family needed transit documents to reach Switzerland before the deportations began. A resistance operative required a new identity after his photograph had been distributed to every police station in Belgium. All of them needed stamps that didn't yet exist. Andrée had connections throughout Brussels. One of them worked as a cleaning woman at Gestapo headquarters. Another had a brother who delivered supplies to the building. A third knew someone who had access to the 3rd floor. These threads were fragile, but they were all she had. The plan was simple in its madness. During the lunch hour, when officers left their desks for the cafeteria downstairs, someone would slip into the documentation office. The stamps were kept in a locked drawer, but locks could be picked. The entire operation would take less than 3 minutes. Walk in during the chaos of the lunch rush. Pick the lock. Take the stamps. Walk out before anyone noticed. It was the kind of plan that could save hundreds of lives or cost a dozen people their lives. There was no middle ground. Either you succeeded completely or you failed catastrophically. The woman who would attempt the theft was not Andrée. She was too valuable to the escape line to risk on a single operation. Instead, the task fell to a man named Philippe, a locksmith before the war who had learned his trade from his father and grandfather. He could open any lock in under 60 seconds. He had steady hands and a face forgettable enough to pass unnoticed through crowds. Philippe sat now at the printer's shop with André, smoking cigarettes and reviewing a floor plan sketched from memory by the cleaning woman. The documentation office was marked with an X. The lunch cafeteria 2 floors below. The exits on every level. The patrol patterns of the guards. 3 minutes, Philippe said, studying the map. His voice was steady, but André noticed his hands trembling slightly as he held the cigarette. I can do it in 3 minutes. If you're caught, André said quietly, we don't know you. We've never met. You were acting alone. Philippe nodded. He understood the rules. In resistance work, everyone was expendable. Capture meant torture, and torture meant betrayal. The only question was how long you could hold out before you broke. The answer was never long enough. They sat in silence, listening to the rumble of trucks passing on the street above. Somewhere in the city, British pilots waited. Jewish families packed what they could carry. Resistance operatives prepared for operations that depended on documents they didn't have. The entire underground railroad of escape routes, safe houses, and brave volunteers was waiting for what Philippe would do in the next 3 minutes. André stubbed out her cigarette and stood. Tomorrow, she said. 1 o'clock. Lunch rush. Philippe nodded and left without another word. The door closed behind him with a sound like a cell locking. What neither of them knew yet was that the stamps Philippe was planning to steal would become the most valuable objects in occupied Belgium. Not because of their monetary worth, but because they represented something the Germans had never anticipated, the possibility that their own bureaucratic machinery could be hijacked and turned against them. The occupation functioned on certainty. Orders were obeyed because disobedience was punished. Documents were accepted because forgery was impossible. Authority was maintained because it was absolute. But absolute systems have absolute vulnerabilities. They depend entirely on the integrity of their symbols. Break the symbol, and the entire system trembles. A single stamp, pressed into the right document, could turn a Jew into an Aryan. Transform a resistance operative into a loyal citizen. Convert an Allied pilot into a Belgian factory worker. Paper could not stop bullets, but paper could make you invisible to those holding the guns. And invisibility was the only real weapon the resistance possessed. Tomorrow, Philippe would either return with the tools to save hundreds of lives, or he would disappear into the basement cells of Gestapo headquarters where screams echoed through concrete walls and nobody asked questions about prisoners who stopped screaming. The risk was absolute. The necessity was total. And in occupied Belgium in 1941, those were the only terms that mattered. Avenue Louise. March 12, 1941. 12:47 p.m. Philippe walked through the entrance of Gestapo headquarters carrying a toolbox that marked him as a maintenance worker. He had rehearsed this walk for days, practiced the posture of someone who belonged, someone whose presence was so ordinary it became invisible. The guards at the entrance barely glanced at his forged work permit before waving him through. The first barrier was behind him. The building was Baroque in architecture, commandeered from a Belgian banking family who had fled to London. Its marble floors echoed with footsteps. Officers moved through hallways with the precise efficiency that characterized every German operation. Philippe took the stairs, avoiding the elevator where conversations might require responses he hadn't prepared. 3rd floor. His watch read 12:51. The lunch hour was underway. Most officers would be in the cafeteria, but not all. There would be stragglers, workaholics, those who ate at their desks. The risk was calculated but never eliminated. The documentation office was at the end of a long corridor lined with doors marked in German, personnel. Records. Classification. Security. Each door represented another layer of the occupation's administrative apparatus. The machinery that processed requisitions for slave labor, orders for deportations, permits for executions. All of it stamped and filed and archived with meticulous care. Philippe turned the handle of the documentation office. Unlocked. A small mercy. Inside, the room was empty except for rows of filing cabinets and a single desk positioned near the window. On the desk sat a typewriter, stacks of blank forms, and a locked drawer built into the desk's right side. His watch read 12:52. 2 minutes had passed since entering the building. 3 minutes remained. He set down the toolbox and removed his lock picks. The lock was standard German military issue, designed more for deterrence than serious security. Germans assumed no one would be foolish enough to break into Gestapo headquarters. The assumption had made them careless. The lock clicked open in 40 seconds. Inside the drawer, arranged in perfect rows, were the stamps. Not just one stamp, but dozens. Each represented a different department, different authorization level, different function in the occupation bureaucracy. Travel permits. Work authorizations. Identity validations. Food ration approvals. Some bore eagles and swastikas. Others showed different German administrative symbols. All were carved in brass, each one capable of transforming blank paper into legitimate documentation. Philippe's hands moved with trained precision. He transferred the stamps from the drawer into his toolbox, wrapping each in cloth to prevent them from clattering. The weight was significant. These small pieces of brass weighed far more than their physical mass suggested. His watch read 12:54. He was ahead of schedule. The drawer was empty. The stamps were secure in his toolbox. He closed the drawer, relocked it with the same care he'd used to open it. A locked drawer suggested nothing had been disturbed. An open drawer would trigger immediate alarm. Philippe picked up the toolbox and turned toward the door. And froze. Through the frosted glass window of the office door, he saw a shadow approaching. Footsteps in the corridor. Not hurried, but purposeful. Someone returning to the office. His mind calculated options with brutal speed. He couldn't leave through the door without encountering whoever was approaching. The window overlooked a 3-story drop to the street below. The filing cabinets offered no hiding place substantial enough to conceal a grown man. The footsteps grew closer. Philippe did the only thing he could. He moved to the opposite side of the room, knelt beside a filing cabinet, and opened the toolbox as if he were servicing the cabinet's lock mechanism. If someone entered, he would appear to be exactly what his forged papers claimed, a maintenance worker performing routine repairs. The door opened. A German officer entered, mid-30s, carrying a folder of documents. He glanced at Philippe with the casual indifference of someone who had seen maintenance workers 1,000 times before. Philippe kept his eyes on the filing cabinet lock, tools in hand, giving every appearance of concentration on his work. "How long?" the officer asked in German. Philippe's rehearsed response came out steady. 5 minutes, sir. Lock mechanism is sticking." The officer grunted acknowledgement and moved to his desk. He didn't open the locked drawer. Instead, he sorted through the documents in his folder, making notes on several forms. Philippe continued working on the filing cabinet lock, manipulating tools to create the sound of repair work, his heart hammering against his ribs with enough force that he feared the officer might hear it. The officer's watch chimed. 1 p.m. He gathered his folder and stood. "See that it's properly fixed," he said, and left the office without a backward glance. Philippe remained kneeling for 10 full seconds after the door closed, waiting for his hands to stop shaking. Then he packed his tools, picked up the toolbox heavy with stolen stamps, and walked toward the corridor. The hallway was no longer empty. Officers were returning from lunch, moving through the building in groups of 2 and 3. Philippe joined the flow of traffic, descending the stairs with the same measured pace he'd used on the way up. Not too fast. Not too slow. Just another worker completing just another routine task. At the ground floor, the guards were checking credentials of visitors more carefully than during the lunch rush. Philippe approached with his forged work permit ready. The guard glanced at it, glanced at Philippe's face, glanced at the toolbox. "Open it," the guard said. Philippe's entire body went cold. Inside the toolbox were the stamps. Wrapped in cloth, but unmistakable for what they were. There was no explanation that would save him. No story that would prevent immediate arrest, immediate interrogation, immediate execution. But his hands remained steady as he set the toolbox on the guard station table and opened the lid. Inside, arranged in neat rows, were wrenches, screwdrivers, lock picks, and various maintenance tools. The stamps, wrapped in cloth at the bottom of the box, were hidden beneath a false bottom that Philippe had installed the night before. Unless someone removed every tool and examined the box's construction, the stamps were invisible. The guard looked at the tools with disinterest. "Close it." Philippe closed the toolbox, nodded respectfully, and walked out the front entrance of Gestapo headquarters into the afternoon sunlight. He had been inside for exactly 13 minutes. The lunch hour was over. Officers were returning to their desks. And in his toolbox, wrapped in cloth beneath a false bottom, Philippe carried the keys to unlock every door in occupied Belgium. He walked 3 blocks before allowing himself to breathe properly. 6 blocks before his hands stopped shaking. By the time he reached the printer's shop near the Grand Place, his heartbeat had almost returned to normal. Andrée was waiting in the basement. She said nothing when Philippe set the toolbox on the table and opened it. She said nothing when he removed the false bottom and revealed the stamps wrapped in cloth. She simply stared at them, understanding immediately what they represented. The resistance now possessed authentic German occupation stamps. They could create documents indistinguishable from legitimate papers. They could move people across Belgium, across borders, across the entire machinery of Nazi control. Philippe had walked into the heart of the occupation and stolen its administrative authority. In doing so, he had transformed the resistance from desperate fugitives into bureaucratic ghosts who could move through the system with the system's own authorization. But neither Philippe nor Andrée yet understood the full implications of what had just happened. They didn't know that these stamps would save thousands of lives over the next 4 years. They didn't know that the theft would force the Germans to change their entire documentation system multiple times, creating chaos in the occupation bureaucracy. They didn't know that what Philippe carried in his toolbox would become one of the most valuable assets in the entire Belgian resistance. What they knew was this: for the first time since the occupation began, they had a weapon that could match German efficiency. Not a gun. Not a bomb. But something far more powerful in a world controlled by paperwork. They had the power to create official truth. And in Nazi-occupied Europe, truth was whatever the stamps said it was. The forgers went to work that same night. In a basement beneath a bookshop in the Morals district, 3 men gathered around a table covered with blank documents, bottles of ink, and the stamps Philippe had stolen. The room smelled of paper and solvent and cigarette smoke. A single overhead bulb cast harsh shadows across their faces. The forgers were artists before the war. One had illustrated children's books. Another had designed theater posters. The third had worked as a commercial printer, creating letterheads and business cards for Brussels merchants. The occupation had made their peacetime skills obsolete. Now their talents would be repurposed for a different kind of creation, making lies indistinguishable from truth. The challenge was not just pressing stamps onto paper. German occupation documents were masterpieces of anti-forgery design. They used specialized paper with watermarks visible only under certain light. They employed multiple ink colors that had to be applied in precise sequence. They included serial numbers that corresponded to central registries maintained by the occupation administration. Every element was designed to prevent exactly what the resistance was attempting. But the stolen stamps changed everything. With authentic stamps, the forgers no longer needed to recreate the intricate details of eagle wings or swastika patterns. Those elements were now perfect, pressed from the actual brass dies used by German authorities. What remained was perfecting everything else: paper texture, ink consistency, form layout, typing style, signature patterns. The first document they created was a travel permit. Standard form, used by thousands of Belgians traveling between cities for work. The forger named Henri examined a legitimate permit obtained from a resistance sympathizer, noting every detail: the paper weight, the fold lines, the slight discoloration from being carried in a wallet, the wear patterns on the corners. Germans notice everything, Henri said, holding the legitimate permit up to the light. The paper must look used, not new. The stamps must be slightly smudged from handling. The typing should be imperfect, as if done quickly by a clerk who processes hundreds of these daily. He selected a piece of paper from their collection, choosing one that matched the texture and weight of German official documentation. He aged it slightly by exposing it to cigarette smoke, creating the faint yellowing that came from weeks in a filing cabinet. He folded it along the same lines as the legitimate permit, creating creases that suggested repeated handling. Then came the typing. German clerks used specific typewriter models with distinctive fonts. The resistance had acquired several of these machines through various means. Henri fed the paper into the typewriter and began filling in the form: name, date of birth, residence address, destination, purpose of travel, authorization period. Each detail had to be perfect. Too neat, and it would appear suspicious. Too messy, and it would be rejected. The goal was to achieve exactly the average quality of a legitimate document produced by a bored clerk on a Tuesday afternoon. The signatures were more challenging. German officers signed thousands of documents weekly. Their signatures had evolved into rapid scrawls that were consistent in overall appearance but varied in specific execution. The forgers practiced these signatures for hours, training their hands to reproduce the characteristic flourishes and angles that marked each officer's particular style. Finally, the stamps. André positioned the travel permit carefully, aligning it with the spots where stamps would typically appear. He inked one of the stolen stamps, pressed it firmly against the paper, and lifted it away. Perfect. The eagle and swastika impressed into the paper with exactly the right weight and clarity. The ink color matched precisely. The positioning was correct. André examined the document under different lighting conditions. He held it next to the legitimate permit, comparing every element. He checked the alignment, the ink consistency, the paper texture. Then he did something that seemed strange to the others watching. He deliberately introduced a small flaw. "What are you doing?" asked Marcel, one of the other forgers. "Making it real," André replied. He used a corner of the stamp to create a slight smudge in the eagle's left wing, the kind of imperfection that occurred when clerks worked too quickly. Perfect documents are suspicious. Real documents have minor flaws. They're handled by tired clerks who are processing their 100th form of the day. They're stamped too hard or not hard enough. The ink sometimes smudges. The typing includes small errors that are corrected with X marks or over-typing. He added a barely visible typing correction, changing a number that had been struck once too hard. He created a faint coffee stain in one corner. He added fingerprints by handling the document with slightly dirty hands. When he finished, the travel permit looked exactly like what it was supposed to be, a legitimate German occupation document processed by a bureaucrat who was competent but not obsessive, efficient but not perfect. "Test it," André said, passing the document to André, who had arrived to check their progress. The test would come tomorrow. A resistance member would use the forged travel permit to board a train from Brussels to Antwerp, passing through 3 checkpoints where German guards examined documents. If the forgery was good enough, he would complete the journey without incident. If not, he would be arrested, interrogated, and likely executed. This was how quality control worked in the resistance. Lives were the measure of success. The forger worked through the night, producing documents with assembly line efficiency. Travel permits for resistance operatives. Identity cards for Jews who needed to disappear into Aryan identities. Work authorization for Allied pilots who needed to blend in as Belgian laborers. Food ration coupons for families hiding fugitives. Each document was a small masterpiece of deception, created with the kind of care that would have made them valuable as art if they weren't instruments of survival. By dawn, they had produced 37 documents. By the end of the week, they would create hundreds more. The operation would continue for months, then years, producing thousands of forged documents that would enable thousands of people to move through occupied Belgium as though they had every right to be there. But the true genius of the operation wasn't the forgery skill. It was the systematic approach to deception that the resistance developed. They created filing systems that tracked which documents had been issued to whom, preventing duplicate identities that might trigger German suspicion. They established protocols for updating documents when Germans changed their stamp designs or security features. They developed networks of informants who provided intelligence about new documentation requirements, allowing forgers to stay ahead of German security measures. Most importantly, they understood that perfect forgery wasn't about creating perfect documents. It was about creating documents that were perfectly average. Documents that blended into the ocean of paperwork that defined the occupation. Documents that passed through checkpoints not because they were scrutinized and found genuine, but because they were so unremarkable that guards barely glanced at them. The occupation ran on bureaucracy, and bureaucracy runs on routine. Guards at checkpoints saw hundreds of travel permits daily. They looked for obvious forgeries, wrong paper, incorrect stamps, suspicious details. But a document that looked exactly like every other document, that showed exactly the right amount of wear and official validation, that fit perfectly into the pattern of what was expected, that document became invisible through its very ordinariness. This was the revolution that the stolen stamps enabled. The resistance had not just acquired the tools to forge documents. They had acquired the ability to make their forgeries indistinguishable from the authentic because their forgeries now included authentic elements pressed into perfect average documents by hands trained to reproduce mediocrity with precision. The first test came the next morning. The resistance member with the forged travel permit boarded his train in Brussels. He passed through the checkpoint at the station without incident. He showed his papers to the conductor without arousing suspicion. He disembarked in Antwerp and walked through the final checkpoint where German soldiers examined documents of everyone leaving the station. The soldier glanced at the travel permit, glanced at the man's face, and waved him through. The test was successful. The forgery was perfect. And in that moment, though nobody yet realized it, the balance of power in occupied Belgium had shifted. The Germans still had the guns and the laws and the machinery of oppression. But the resistance now had something equally powerful, the ability to move through that machinery as though they belonged there, authorized by the occupation's own stamps, invisible in plain sight. The paper cage that had trapped Belgium was now a cage with doors that could be opened from the inside. And every door opened with stamps that had been stolen from the very heart of the occupation itself. Andrée de Jongh stood in a safe house in the Ixelles district, studying a map of Europe pinned to the wall. Red lines traced escape routes from Brussels through France to Spain. Each line represented weeks of planning, dozens of guides, hundreds of risks. The Comet Line, as the network was now called, had successfully evacuated 43 Allied airmen since its formation. Each evacuation had required forged documents at multiple points along the journey. Now, with the stolen stamps, the mathematics of salvation had changed entirely. Before the theft, the Comet Line could move perhaps 3 people weekly, limited by the availability of legitimate papers or the time required to produce convincing forgeries. After the theft, that number could potentially increase to dozens. The bottleneck was no longer documents but everything else: safe houses, guides, money, courage. But André understood something that would prove crucial in the months ahead: more documents meant more risk as well as more opportunity. Every forged paper represented a potential failure point. If one document was detected as false, German security would increase scrutiny of all documents. If one forgery was traced back to its source, the entire operation could collapse. The resistance needed to use the stamps carefully. Strategically. Not flooding the system with forgeries that might alert the occupation to the theft, but deploying them with enough frequency to save as many lives as possible. This created an unbearable moral calculus. How many documents could they create before triggering German suspicion? Which lives should be saved first? British pilots who could return to combat? Jewish families facing deportation? Resistance operatives conducting sabotage operations? Every choice meant implicitly choosing who would not receive help. The first major operation using the stolen stamps targeted a problem that had plagued the resistance for months: the isolation of Allied airmen shot down over Belgium. These men would bail out of burning bombers, land in fields or forests, and immediately face the problem of movement. They spoke no Flemish or French. They carried no papers. They wore flight suits that marked them as Allied personnel. Without help, their capture was inevitable. The Comet Line had developed protocols for collecting these men, hiding them in safe houses, and moving them along the escape route to Spain. But the journey from crash site to safety required documents at every stage: false identity cards that transformed British pilots into Belgian workers, travel permits for train journeys, work authorization for movements through checkpoints. With the stolen stamps, the forgery operation could produce complete document packages in hours rather than weeks. A pilot shot down on Monday could be equipped with perfect papers by Wednesday and on a train to Paris by Friday. The impact was immediate and measurable. In April 1941, the month after the stamp theft, the Comet Line evacuated 12 airmen. In May, 19. By June, the number reached 27. Each successful evacuation represented not just a saved life but a trained pilot who could return to bombing operations against German targets. The strategic value was enormous. But Jewish families represented an even more urgent category. The deportations had begun in earnest in mid-1942. German efficiency had been applied to the systematic removal of Jews from Belgium to concentration camps in Poland. The process required documentation at every stage: identification of Jewish families through registration records, orders for deportation, transportation manifests, arrival confirmations at camps. The entire machinery of genocide ran on paperwork. The resistance discovered they could disrupt this machinery with counter-paperwork. Forged documents could transform Jews into Aryans in official records. A family registered as Jewish could receive new identity cards showing Christian background. Their children could receive baptismal certificates backdated years. Their work permits could be reissued showing different surnames and birthplaces. With enough documentation, an entire family could disappear from German registration systems and reappear with new identities that placed them beyond deportation orders. This type of forgery was far more dangerous than creating travel permits. It required infiltrating German registration offices, altering existing records, creating entire false histories that would withstand cross-referencing against multiple databases. The consequences of failure weren't just arrest of the forgers but identification and deportation of the families they were trying to save. Yet the resistance attempted it anyway, understanding that the risk was absolute but so was the necessity. The operation required coordination across multiple cells. One team would identify Jewish families who needed new identities. Another would research available identities of deceased or relocated Belgians whose papers could be appropriated. A third would infiltrate registration offices to alter or destroy records linking families to their Jewish identities. The forgers would then create complete documentation packages including not just identity cards but birth certificates, marriage licenses, employment records, residence permits, every piece of paper that might be demanded by suspicious officials. The stolen stamps were essential to this work. Without them, no forged identity card would pass even casual scrutiny. With them, the resistance could create documents that appeared in every way legitimate, validated by the occupation's own bureaucratic authority. The first major test case involved the Weinstein family, parents, 3 children, living in Anderlecht. Their names appeared on deportation lists scheduled for July 1942. They had 2 weeks before transport to Mechelen, the Belgian transit camp where Jews were held before deportation to Auschwitz. The resistance created new identities. The family became the Dubois, Walloon Belgians from a small village near Liège. The forgers produced birth certificates, marriage licenses, residence permits, work authorization, food ration cards, everything the Dubois family would need to exist legitimately in occupied Belgium. The stamps validated every document. On the scheduled deportation date, German police arrived at the Weinstein residence and found it empty. Records showed the family had relocated to Brussels weeks earlier. When police checked Brussels addresses, they found a family named Dubois living at the location, but the Dubois had papers showing they were Walloon Catholics who had lived in the city for years. The paperwork was perfect. The Germans found no connection to the Weinsteins and moved on to other targets. The Dubois family, formerly Weinstein, lived through the war under their new identity. The 3 children survived. They had been saved by stamps stolen from a Gestapo office desk drawer. This pattern repeated hundreds of times across Belgium. Families disappeared from deportation lists and reappeared with new names, new backgrounds, new documentation that made them invisible to the machinery hunting them. Not all succeeded. Some forgeries were detected. Some families were caught anyway through informants or bad luck or German thoroughness. But hundreds who would certainly have died in concentration camps instead survived, hidden in plain sight by paperwork validated with stolen stamps. The strategic impact extended beyond individual rescues. The Germans had designed their deportation system to process Jews with industrial efficiency. Registration, collection, transport, extermination, each stage ran according to precise schedules that depended on accurate paperwork. When families began disappearing from lists, when records showed contradictions, when officials found discrepancies in databases, the system experienced friction. German administrators responded by increasing documentation requirements, adding new security features to stamps, implementing additional cross-checks in registration systems. All of this slowed the deportation process. Every bureaucratic complication meant delays. Every delay meant more time for families to escape or hide. The resistance couldn't stop the genocide, but they could throw sand into its gears. By late 1943, the Germans had become aware that authentic occupation stamps had been compromised. They couldn't determine when or how many stamps had been stolen, so they implemented wholesale changes to their documentation systems, new stamp designs, new paper types, new serial numbering systems, new authentication procedures. The resistance adapted. Sympathetic workers in German administrative offices provided intelligence about the new systems. Forgers developed techniques to replicate the new security features. In some cases, operatives conducted additional thefts to acquire updated stamps. The cycle continued, German security improved, resistance forgery advanced, German security improved again. What the Germans never fully understood was that their response to the stamp theft actually increased the effectiveness of resistance forgery operations. Each security update created confusion in the implementation period when officials were learning new procedures. Each documentation change meant temporary chaos at checkpoints where guards weren't sure what the new papers should look like. The resistance exploited these windows of uncertainty, moving people through the system during the moments when the system itself was most confused about its own rules. The moral mathematics remained unbearable. Even with perfect documents, the resistance could only help a fraction of those who needed help. Resources were limited. Safe houses could only hide so many families. Guides could only move so many people at once. Every person saved meant someone else who couldn't be saved because the slot was taken, the papers were used, the risk budget was exhausted. Andrée de Jongh understood this with brutal clarity. She was now one of the most wanted people in Belgium, her photograph distributed to every German security office, rewards posted for information leading to her capture. She continued working anyway, calculating risks and benefits with the cold precision necessary for survival. Each operation was a bet that success was possible and failure was acceptable. The mathematics were never in anyone's favor, but they were the only mathematics available. By 1944, the Comet Line had evacuated over 700 Allied airmen. Hundreds of Jewish families had received false documentation. Thousands of resistance operatives had moved through Belgium conducting sabotage operations enabled by forged papers. The stolen stamps had made all of this possible. But the cost was measured in more than successful evacuations. It was measured in the guides who were caught and executed. The forgers who were arrested and tortured. The families who were betrayed despite perfect papers. The operations that failed because someone made a mistake or got unlucky or encountered an unusually suspicious guard. This was the mathematics of salvation in occupied Europe. You saved everyone you could, understanding you couldn't save everyone, and you lived with the weight of those calculations for the rest of your life. By autumn 1943, SS Sturmbannführer Klaus Hoffmann had developed what he considered to be a sophisticated understanding of resistance forgery operations. From his office in the Brussels Gestapo headquarters, he coordinated efforts to detect and eliminate document fraud that had been plaguing the occupation since 1941. Hoffmann was methodical. He approached the forgery problem the way an engineer approaches a mechanical failure, by analyzing the system to locate points of vulnerability and then reinforcing those points until failure becomes impossible. He began by studying authentic documents that resistance members had used successfully to pass checkpoints. Hoffmann laid these documents on his desk and examined each one under magnifying glass, noting every detail, stamp pressure, ink consistency, paper texture, typing patterns. He was looking for deviations from standard, for patterns that suggested forgery. What troubled him was how few deviations he found. The resistance documents were too good. They weren't just convincing forgeries. They were virtually indistinguishable from legitimate papers. The stamps appeared authentic down to microscopic detail. The paper matched occupation standards exactly. Even the aging patterns, the wear, the discoloration, the fold lines, seemed perfectly natural. Hoffmann realized with growing concern that the resistance must have access to authentic occupation stamps. There was no other explanation for the quality of the forgeries being produced. He launched an investigation into possible stamp thefts, requesting reports from all German administrative offices about missing equipment. The investigation took weeks and eventually revealed what had been suspected: stamps had disappeared from multiple offices over the past 2 years. Most thefts had gone unreported because clerks feared punishment for carelessness. The scope of the compromise was worse than anyone had imagined. Not just 1 or 2 stamps but potentially dozens had been stolen from various locations. Each stamp represented a security breach that compromised the entire documentation system. Hoffmann's response was comprehensive. He ordered immediate replacement of all occupation stamps across Belgium. New designs were implemented featuring updated security elements, finer line work that would be difficult to replicate, UV-reactive inks invisible under normal light, microscopic serial numbers embedded in the stamp impressions themselves. He established new protocols for stamp security. Stamps would be stored in safes rather than desk drawers, inventory checks would be conducted weekly, any missing stamps would trigger immediate investigation rather than being quietly covered up by embarrassed clerks. Most significantly, Hoffmann created a specialized unit dedicated to document verification. Guards at checkpoints and stations were trained to recognize forgery indicators. They were given UV lights to check for security inks. They were taught to examine serial numbers and cross-reference them against master lists. They were instructed to look for patterns of documentation that might suggest resistance activity, multiple travel permits to the same destinations, clusters of identity cards issued on the same dates, unusual movement patterns by supposed workers. The resistance felt the pressure immediately. Checkpoint guards became more thorough in their examinations. Documents that had passed without question months earlier now triggered additional scrutiny. Several resistance members were arrested when guards noticed irregularities in their papers. The forgers had to scramble to adapt to the new stamp designs, new security features, new authentication procedures. But Hoffmann had underestimated one crucial factor: the resistance was not a static organization. It learned and adapted faster than the bureaucratic apparatus of the occupation could implement changes. When new stamps were introduced, resistance sympathizers working in German administrative offices immediately provided samples to forgers. When UV-reactive inks were implemented, the resistance acquired the same inks from suppliers who sold to German authorities. When serial number requirements were added, infiltrators accessed the master lists that guards used for verification. The occupation ran on German efficiency, but efficiency requires consistency, and consistency creates predictability. The resistance exploited that predictability, staying just ahead of each new security measure by understanding that bureaucratic systems move slowly while motivated individuals move quickly. Hoffmann's most creative countermeasure involved creating a database of all legitimate documents issued across Belgium. This required enormous effort, collecting records from hundreds of administrative offices, digitizing information, creating cross-referencing systems that would allow guards to verify whether a document was registered in the central system. The resistance learned about the database from sympathizers who worked in the offices compiling it. They adapted by creating forged documents whose serial numbers matched authentic papers belonging to Belgians who had died or relocated. The forgers would research recently deceased individuals, acquire their documentation information, and create new papers using those legitimate identities. When guards checked the database, they would find the serial numbers registered properly, the information matching what was on record. This cat and mouse continued throughout 1943 and into 1944. German security improved. Resistance forgery became more sophisticated. Detection methods advanced. Evasion techniques evolved. Neither side could achieve decisive advantage because both were learning continuously. Hoffmann arrested several forgers during this period. Under interrogation, they revealed nothing useful because the resistance had structured operations in cells where each group knew only what was necessary for their specific function. Forgers didn't know who stole stamps. Stamp thieves didn't know where forgeries were being produced. Couriers who delivered documents didn't know the identities of people receiving them. This cellular structure meant that even successful arrests rarely compromised more than a small portion of the operation. The network would lose a forger or a safe house or a courier, but the overall system continued functioning because no single person possessed enough information to bring down the entire operation. What Hoffmann never fully appreciated was that the resistance didn't need to win the security competition. They only needed to maintain sufficient capability to keep moving people through the system. If 9 out of 10 forged documents passed checkpoints successfully, that was acceptable. If 1 in 10 was detected and resulted in arrest, that was considered an acceptable loss rate given the alternative of not attempting movement at all. The occupation, by contrast, needed near-perfect detection to maintain control. Every successful forgery represented a failure of the security apparatus. Every person who moved through checkpoints with false papers was a breach that undermined occupation authority. The Germans needed to catch every forgery. The resistance only needed to succeed often enough to keep operating. This asymmetry was fundamental. The occupation had to defend everything. The resistance only had to find and exploit weaknesses. The occupation had to process millions of legitimate documents along with forged ones. The resistance only had to produce forgeries good enough to blend into that massive flow of paperwork. By spring 1944, with Allied invasion imminent, Hoffmann's reports to Berlin reflected growing frustration. The forgery problem had not been solved despite massive investment in new security measures. Resistance document operations continued, perhaps even expanding. German checkpoints were catching more forgeries, but even more were getting through. The stolen stamps had created a problem that couldn't be solved through better stamps. The real issue was that the resistance had learned to think like the occupation, to understand its logic and procedures and vulnerabilities. They had internalized the system deeply enough to subvert it from within. A few weeks before D-Day, Hoffman ordered yet another complete replacement of all occupation stamps across Belgium. New designs, new security features, new procedures. The changeover created chaos in German administrative offices as clerks struggled to process documents using unfamiliar equipment according to new protocols. The resistance exploited this chaos perfectly. During the confused implementation period, they moved dozens of people through checkpoints where guards weren't sure what the new documents should look like, accepting papers as legitimate simply because they looked official, and the guards lacked confidence in their ability to identify problems. Hoffman never solved the forgery problem. The liberation of Belgium in September 1944 ended the occupation before he could implement his next round of security improvements. His files, captured by Allied forces, revealed the extraordinary effort the Germans had invested in trying to defeat resistance document operations. But the files also revealed something else. Hoffman had never identified the original theft from Gestapo headquarters in March 1941. He knew stamps had been compromised. He knew resistance forgeries were too good to be produced without authentic stamps. But he never traced the problem back to Philippe's 3-minute operation in that third-floor office. The architecture of detection had been sophisticated, comprehensive, and continuously improving. But it had been built to protect a system after that system had already been breached at its foundation. And no amount of security improvements could change the fact that the resistance had stolen not just stamps but the understanding of how the occupation validated its own authority. They had learned to speak the language of official documentation with fluency that made their lies indistinguishable from truth. In occupied Europe, that fluency was worth more than any weapon. Marie Blomert stood in her apartment on Rue de la Loi, holding an identity card that claimed she was Angeline Moreau, born 1912 in Mons, currently residing in Brussels and employed as a seamstress. Every detail was false. Every stamp was authentic. She was Jewish. The card said she was Catholic. She was 41. The card said she was 31. She had lived in Brussels her entire life. The card claimed she had only recently relocated from Wallonia. These lies, validated by stamps stolen 3 years earlier, were all that stood between Marie and deportation to Auschwitz. The psychological weight of living under a false identity was something the resistance organizers had not fully anticipated. They had focused on the technical challenge of producing forgeries and the logistical challenge of distributing them. But they had underestimated the profound disorientation of being forced to forget your own name, your own history, your own identity. Marie had practiced her new biography for weeks. Angeline Moreau grew up in Mons, the daughter of a postal clerk and a housewife. She attended Catholic school until age 14, then learned dressmaking from her aunt. She moved to Brussels in 1938 seeking better employment opportunities. She lived alone, had no close family, belonged to no organizations that might keep records of membership. The story was deliberately forgettable, designed to be uninteresting enough that officials would not probe for additional details. But Marie had to remember every element, had to inhabit the identity so completely that if awakened from sleep and asked her mother's maiden name, she would immediately answer, Beaumont, without hesitation. The false identity created a peculiar form of isolation. Marie could not contact anyone who knew her real name. She could not visit her parents' graves. She could not acknowledge her own daughter, who had been given a different false identity and sent to live in Liège with a family who believed she was a distant cousin from Antwerp. The resistance had split up Jewish families deliberately. Keeping families together made them more vulnerable to exposure. If one member was identified as Jewish, investigators would examine everyone in the household. By separating family members and giving each person different false identities in different cities, the resistance created a buffer of deniability. If Marie was caught, her daughter might survive because there would be no documented connection between them. But this meant Marie had transformed from a mother with a daughter into Angeline Moreau, a spinster seamstress who lived alone and had no children. Every evening, she sat in her apartment remembering a daughter she could not visit, could not write to, could not acknowledge existed. The psychological burden of this separation was crushing. Yet it was the price of survival, and thousands of Jewish families paid it throughout the occupation. Living under false identity required constant vigilance. Marie had to be careful never to respond to her real name if someone shouted it on the street. She had to train herself to react naturally to Angeline even when distracted or stressed. She had to avoid locations where people might recognize her from her previous life. She had to develop entirely new habits, new patterns of behavior, new ways of interacting with the world. This vigilance was exhausting. The mental energy required to maintain a false identity while simultaneously monitoring for threats while also conducting the ordinary activities of daily life left people depleted. Many who lived under false papers developed stress-related illnesses, insomnia, anxiety disorders, depression, physical symptoms that had no medical explanation. The resistance tried to provide support, but their resources were limited. What they could offer was connection to others in similar situations, small gatherings where people using false identities could speak honestly about their real lives for a few hours before returning to their manufactured personas. At one such gathering in early 1944, Marie met a man who introduced himself as Thomas Laurent. After an hour of conversation, after establishing mutual trust, he revealed his real name, David Katz. He was a teacher from Liège, now living in Brussels as a warehouse clerk. His wife had been deported before he obtained false papers. His 2 sons were in hiding separately, and he had not seen them in 8 months. "I forget sometimes," David said quietly. "I forget who I really am. I wake up and for a moment I believe I actually am Thomas Laurent. Then I remember, and it feels like drowning." This forgetting of self was common among people living under false identities for extended periods. The human mind adapts to whatever reality it must inhabit. When you spend months living as someone else, responding to a different name, telling a different history, the fabricated identity begins to feel more real than the authentic one you abandoned. Some people found this transition disturbing. Others found it oddly comforting. To become someone else completely was to escape not just Nazi persecution but the weight of your own history. For people whose families had been murdered, whose communities had been destroyed, whose entire previous lives had been obliterated, the false identity offered a form of psychological escape from unbearable memories. But this escape carried its own cost. When liberation came, when it became safe to reclaim real identities, many people who had lived under false papers for years struggled to reintegrate their authentic selves. They had become the people they had pretended to be, and returning to who they had been required abandoning identities they had inhabited so fully that those identities had become real. The resistance tried to prepare people for this possibility, but there was no adequate preparation. You couldn't know what it would feel like to live as someone else until you actually did it. And by the time you understood the psychological cost, you were already committed to paying it. Marie survived the war as Angeline Moreau. She maintained her false identity until September 1944, when Allied forces liberated Brussels. She reclaimed her real name, located her daughter, and attempted to rebuild the fragments of her former life. But she found that she couldn't simply return to being Marie Blomert. That person had effectively died in 1942 when she became Angeline Moreau. The woman who survived was something between the two identities, Marie's memories inhabited by Angeline's habits, speaking with Marie's voice but moving through the world with Angeline's careful vigilance. Her daughter, who had lived as Catherine Dubois for 3 years, experienced similar disorientation. She had been 12 when she became Catherine. She was 15 when she reclaimed her real name. Those years had been formative, and she had formed as Catherine, not as herself. Reintegrating her authentic identity felt like putting on clothes that no longer fit properly. This psychological aftermath was rarely discussed after the war. The focus was on physical survival, on reuniting families, on prosecuting war criminals, on rebuilding destroyed communities. But thousands of people who had survived through false identities carried internal fractures that never fully healed. The stamps that had made their false identities possible had saved their lives. But the false identities had required them to surrender something essential about themselves. They had traded who they were for the possibility of surviving to become someone else. It was a trade most made willingly, understanding it was the only option available. But willing surrender is still surrender, and what was surrendered could never be fully recovered. Years after the war, Marie would still occasionally respond to Angeline, before remembering that Angeline Moreau had never really existed. The false identity that had protected her for 3 years had embedded itself so deeply that it couldn't be completely extracted even after it served its purpose. This was the hidden cost of survival through forgery. The documents were temporary. The stamps were pieces of brass pressed into paper. But the identities those documents created left permanent impressions on the people who inhabited them. Paper shadows cast by stolen stamps continued to haunt those who had survived in their protection long after the occupation ended and the need for false identities had passed. In October 1944, 1 month after the liberation of Brussels, the Belgian resistance compiled its final accounting of operations conducted during the occupation. The numbers were staggering and incomplete. They would remain incomplete forever because much of what the resistance accomplished had deliberately left no records. But from fragmentary evidence, captured German documents, survivor testimonies, and resistance archives that survived the war, a picture emerged of what the stolen stamps had enabled. The Comet Line evacuated 775 Allied airmen using forged documents created with the stamps. British intelligence estimated these pilots returned to combat operations that conducted approximately 8,000 additional bombing missions. The strategic value was measured not just in airmen saved but in military operations enabled. Jewish families. The resistance created false identities for at least 2,400 Jews using documentation validated by the stolen stamps. This number was certainly low because many operations were never recorded. Families who survived had no reason to document how they survived, and many took their secrets to their graves. Resistance operatives. Thousands of Belgian, French, and Dutch resistance members moved through Belgium conducting sabotage operations using forged papers. The exact number was unknowable because successful resistance operations left minimal trace. But captured German reports documented hundreds of acts of sabotage by operatives whose movement had been enabled by false documentation. The cascade of consequences extended far beyond these direct numbers. The stolen stamps had created capabilities that multiplied through the entire resistance network. Documents that allowed one person to move freely enabled that person to coordinate operations that involved dozens of others. Identity papers that protected one family prevented the arrest of the people hiding them. Travel permits that moved one agent to a target enabled sabotage that disrupted supplies for thousands of German troops. But the accounting also included costs that couldn't be measured in numbers. Philippe, the locksmith who had stolen the stamps in March 1941, was arrested by the Gestapo in June 1943. Someone had informed on him, though who and why was never determined. He was interrogated, tortured, and eventually executed. He never revealed information about resistance operations despite 6 weeks of interrogation. Andrée, the lead forger, died during a British bombing raid in 1944. He had been working in the basement where forgeries were produced when the building above took a direct hit. The irony was bitter, killed by the Allied forces he had worked to support. Andrée de Jongh was captured in January 1943 while guiding airmen across the Pyrenees. She was imprisoned in Ravensbrück concentration camp for the remainder of the war. She survived, but dozens of guides in the Comet Line network did not. The German response to document forgery operations had been comprehensive and brutal. Between 1941 and 1944, the Gestapo arrested over 200 people suspected of involvement in resistance forgery networks. Most were executed. Some died under interrogation. A few survived concentration camps. Every arrest created ripple effects. When a forger was captured, operations had to be suspended while the resistance evaluated what information might have been compromised. Safe houses had to be abandoned. Contacts had to go underground. People waiting for documents had to wait longer or find alternative options that might not exist. The Germans also implemented collective punishment policies. When resistance forgery operations were discovered in a particular district, occupation authorities would increase restrictions on the entire area, additional checkpoints, more thorough document inspections, random identity verifications. These measures made life harder for everyone, not just resistance members. This created moral complexity that the resistance struggled to navigate. Every forgery operation carried the risk of triggering broader repression that would impact innocent civilians. Was it justified to conduct operations that might save a dozen lives but would certainly make life more difficult for thousands? The resistance decided it was justified, but the decision was never easy and never felt entirely clean. Liberation would prove them right, but during the occupation, the moral calculations remained ambiguous and painful. Post-war analysis by historians revealed something the resistance had not fully understood during the occupation. The stolen stamps had forced the Germans to divert significant resources to security measures that might otherwise have been used for military purposes. The constant cycle of implementing new stamps, training checkpoint guards, creating verification databases, investigating forgeries, all of this required personnel, funding, and attention that the occupation administration had to pull from other priorities. The strategic impact was difficult to quantify but certainly real. German efficiency had been degraded by the need to defend against resistance forgery operations. The occupation had been forced to treat its own documentation as a vulnerability requiring constant protection. This was not the dramatic sabotage of bridges or assassinations of officers that characterized some resistance activities. This was slower, quieter subversion that accumulated effects over time. But the cumulative impact was substantial. German administrative capacity was partially occupied with defending against operations enabled by stamps stolen from their own offices. The final consequence emerged only after liberation, when the full scope of the Holocaust became known. The resistance document operations had saved a few thousand Jewish lives out of more than 6 million murdered. The number was simultaneously enormous, thousands of individuals who lived because of forged papers, and utterly inadequate given the scale of genocide. Many resistance members struggled with this knowledge after the war. They had done everything possible with the resources available. They had risked their lives repeatedly. They had saved everyone they could reach. But it had been nowhere near enough. Marie Blomert, who had survived as Angeline Moreau, lost her parents and 2 siblings in Auschwitz. They had been deported before the resistance could create false identities for them. Marie had survived. They had not. The arbitrary nature of who received help and who didn't haunted her for the remainder of her life. "We saved those we could reach," she said in a 1989 interview. But most were beyond our reach. The stamps opened some doors. Most doors remained closed. This became the uncomfortable truth that defined post-war understanding of resistance document operations. They had been simultaneously successful and insufficient. Lives had been saved that would certainly have been lost without forged papers. But the vast majority of those who needed saving had not been reached. The cascade of consequences included this psychological burden carried by survivors and resistance members alike. The knowledge that more could have been saved if resources had been greater, if the theft had happened earlier, if the network had been larger, if risks had been taken faster. But history offers no alternative timelines. It offers only what actually happened. And what actually happened was that stamps stolen in a 3-minute operation in March 1941 had enabled resistance operations that saved thousands of lives over the following 3 years. The weight of those who weren't saved did not diminish the value of those who were. But neither did the accomplishment of saving thousands eliminate the grief for the millions who perished. This dual reality, tremendous success measured against overwhelming tragedy, became the legacy that resistance document forgers carried forward into peacetime. They had changed history with stolen stamps. They had opened doors that the occupation had believed were locked. They had proved that even the most comprehensive systems of control contain vulnerabilities that determined individuals can exploit. But they had also learned the limits of what resistance could accomplish against industrial genocide. Paper could save lives. It could not stop the machinery of extermination. The cascade of consequences extended outward from that moment when Philippe had walked out of Gestapo headquarters with stamps in his toolbox: lives saved, operations enabled, strategic impacts, personal costs, moral ambiguities, incomplete victories. And one final consequence that would only become clear decades later: the demonstration that even in the darkest periods of history, even under the most comprehensive systems of oppression, ordinary people could acquire tools that allowed them to subvert authority and protect the vulnerable. The stamps had been brass and ink. But what they represented was the possibility of resistance itself. Brussels. November 1989. In a small apartment near the Atomium, a woman now in her late 70s carefully opened a wooden box she had kept hidden for 45 years. Inside, wrapped in cloth, was a single brass stamp bearing an eagle and swastika. She had kept it through decades of peace, through marriage and children, through the long process of building a normal life after surviving occupation. The stamp was one of those stolen by Philippe in March 1941. How it had come into her possession was a story she had never told anyone. But she had kept it, and now, watching news reports of the Berlin Wall falling, she understood why. The stamp represented something fundamental about the nature of power and the possibility of resistance. It was a physical object that had once held extraordinary authority, the ability to transform lies into official truth. But that authority had only ever existed because people chose to recognize it. The stamp had power because German soldiers at checkpoints had been trained to see it as legitimate. Without that recognition, it was just brass and ink. The resistance had understood this intuitively. They had stolen not just stamps but the understanding that official authority was performative. It required constant validation through symbols and procedures and documentation. But symbols could be stolen. Procedures could be learned. Documentation could be forged. In exploiting these vulnerabilities, the resistance had revealed something about all systems of control: they are only as strong as the assumptions they rest on. The Nazi occupation had assumed its documentation system was secure. The resistance had tested that assumption and found it false. A single theft had exposed the brittleness of bureaucratic authority. The woman holding the stamp, her name was Sophie, and she had been a courier for the resistance, remembered the first time she had carried forged documents across Brussels. The papers had been created using the stolen stamps. They had looked absolutely authentic because in every way that mattered, they were authentic. The stamps were real. The paper was correct. Only the information was false. She remembered the guard at the checkpoint examining her travel permit, his eyes scanning the stamps, his expression showing nothing but routine boredom. He had waved her through. She had walked past him carrying papers that identified her as someone she was not, authorized to travel where she had no right to be, validated by the occupation's own symbols of authority. That moment, that utterly ordinary moment of a guard accepting false documents as legitimate, had contained something revolutionary. The occupation's power over movement and identity had been subverted using the occupation's own administrative tools. This was what the stamp in the box represented: proof that even totalitarian systems could be hacked, that resistance was possible even against overwhelming force, that ordinary people with courage and skill could find vulnerabilities in systems that appeared invincible. Sophie had kept the stamp as a reminder. Not of the occupation's power, but of its vulnerability. Not of German authority, but of Belgian resistance. Not of what had been lost, but of what had been saved. She rewrapped the stamp and closed the box. Tomorrow, she would donate it to the War Museum in Brussels, where it would be displayed with a placard explaining its history. Visitors would see it and perhaps understand what a single piece of brass had enabled during the darkest years of the 20th century. But the true legacy of the stamps extended beyond museums. In the decades after the war, the story of the stolen stamps became something larger than historical fact. It became a parable about resistance itself, the idea that systems of oppression, no matter how comprehensive, always contain points of vulnerability. That ordinary people with extraordinary courage can find those points and exploit them. That authority is performative and therefore can be subverted through performance. The resistance members who had used forged documents rarely spoke publicly about their experiences. The weight of memory was too heavy, the losses too profound. But privately, among themselves, they shared an understanding that what they had done mattered not just for who they saved but for what they proved about the possibility of resistance. They had faced an occupation that controlled every aspect of daily life through documentation. They had stolen the tools that created that documentation. They had learned to forge the symbols that validated authority. And they had used those forged symbols to move people through the system, to save lives, to conduct operations, to subvert control from within. This was not the dramatic resistance of armed combat. This was the patient, careful, dangerous work of undermining authority through bureaucratic subversion. It required different courage, not the courage to charge into battle but the courage to stand at a checkpoint holding false papers and wait for the guard to accept them as real. Thousands of people had stood at such checkpoints during the occupation. Some had been caught. Most had passed through. And each successful passage had been a small victory that accumulated over time into something larger, proof that the occupation's power was not absolute. The Germans had controlled the land, the government, the military, the police. But they had not controlled the imagination of resistance. And imagination found the gaps in their control, the vulnerabilities in their systems, the moments where authority could be challenged through performance of legitimacy. The stolen stamps had enabled this performance. They had provided the props necessary for resistance members to act as though they were authorized to move freely, and in acting that way, to actually move freely. The performance had become reality through the complicity of guards who saw stamps and assumed legitimacy. This was the deeper lesson of the stamps, that power is maintained through assumptions, and assumptions can be challenged. That resistance need not always be confrontational. Sometimes it can be mimicry, becoming so indistinguishable from legitimate that authority cannot tell the difference. The women and men who had risked everything to create and use forged documents understood this in their bones. They had inhabited false identities so completely that even trained security officials couldn't detect the deception. They had moved through the occupation's checkpoints with papers that looked authentic because they were authentic in every way except the information they contained. And this distinction, between authentic symbols and authentic information, had been enough to save thousands of lives. Sophie donated the stamp to the museum in 1990. It was placed in an exhibit about Belgian resistance operations, displayed alongside forged documents that had been preserved after the war. School groups visited and listened to lectures about occupation and resistance. Historians studied the exhibits and published papers about document forgery operations. But the stamp's deepest lesson remained difficult to communicate through museum displays. It was felt rather than explained, the understanding that even under total domination, resistance remains possible. That systems claiming absolute power always contain vulnerabilities. That ordinary people with courage and ingenuity can find ways to subvert even the most comprehensive control. The brass stamp with its eagle and swastika had once represented Nazi authority over Belgium. Then it had been stolen. Then it had been used to create documents that undermined that authority. Now it represented something entirely different, the enduring possibility of resistance against oppression. What remains after occupation ends is not just the physical objects that survived but the knowledge that resistance was possible. That courage was found. That people who should have been powerless discovered sources of power in unexpected places. The stamps were brass. The documents were paper. The identities were performance. But what they created was real, lives saved, operations enabled, proof that totalitarian systems can be subverted from within. This is what remains. Not triumph, because the cost was too high and the losses too great. Not celebration, because what was saved could never compensate for what was destroyed. What remains is knowledge, that when authority becomes oppression, resistance becomes necessary. That even comprehensive systems of control contain vulnerabilities. That ordinary people with extraordinary courage can find those vulnerabilities and exploit them. And that sometimes, resistance begins with 3 minutes in an office, a locked drawer opened, and stamps that would be pressed into documents that would open doors throughout occupied Europe. The stamps are in museums now. The forgers are mostly gone. The people they saved are old or dead. But the lesson remains, waiting to be learned by anyone who needs it: resistance is possible, even when it seems impossible. That knowledge, more than any physical object, is what truly remains.